panel, but it is not really a panel. It's very nebulous, and we're hoping those of you who didn't get a chance to ask questions to that question, we're hoping those of you who attended and talked might have questions that you want to ask. And it's sort of this call to action. So we're trying to figure out, what did we miss? Where's our next steps? I think Erica's question that she posed at the end of our last panel was really essential. Like, what do we do with this besides just collective sigh and then have white people have to learn this all over again? And then also we're hoping, Larissa and I are hoping to really create a collective syllabus, because in some ways I think the classroom is a way to make sure this doesn't get forgotten. And so how do we create a really powerful document that lives on past this gathering, and then hopefully kind of slowly invades classrooms nationwide, right? So yeah, we can start with that question again, and any of you who want to maybe answer it that didn't get an opportunity to, and then we'll just kind of open it up for discussion. If any of y'all want to get closer or move around at any point, feel free. Erica, do you want to answer your question?
Well, please give us the answer.
That was the
Okay,
reason
fair.
you asked a question.
Fair.
No,
I
I can broach it, and then I'm sure others will jump in. But just continuing, I think it really is listening to folks who we have who we have acted as though they're at the margins when they're really at the center of both the problem and the solution. So, and the reason like that struck me last panel around demonology is that Black women historically have been thought of as evil, you know, and I think those are the sites that we have to begin to give much greater consideration to, and really tune into what and whom have we called evil, and start listening to those voices. So to my mind, that's the starting point. Queer folk, women folk, and in all of my research, those have been the first, out of reasons of survival, those have been the first folks to use certain technologies. The first people on the internet and creating certain technologies. And so it's really telling that these have been some of the first people to envision new pathways, new movements towards freedom. And these are the bad folks, quote unquote. So I think that's our first stop.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me after 2016, you know, so many white people were like, how could Trump have been elected? And then the response by the New York Times, you know, was going to every diner they could and interviewing white people, but who they weren't interviewing were the people who were not surprised by this. And so part of the question is how do you encourage institutional buy-in for that kind of listening, and where it's almost like how do you convince editors, like who to put the microphone in front of, and that becomes extra challenging, because then, you know, do you have thoughts about how that listening can be facilitated? Like, how do you get gatekeepers to buy into that idea?
Yeah, I wouldn't say facilitation is one part of it, but the other F word, financing.
Oh,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
like funding work is really important, because the work is already happening.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I think figuring out how to funnel resources to folks is really important, and I'm thinking in terms of more public facing work, and like thinking about the museum. Some questions that we're often asking is who gets to tell the story, is often who gets funded, and so how do we fund those kinds of storytellers becomes really important to my mind.
we can stay on this question, we can open it up as well.
I'll say one thing about it. I think what makes the question around what to do immensely sort of challenging, to say the absolute least, is that it seems like we're we're living in a kind of moment, though not the first of its kind, where criticism is yeah, I mean, we're having some major trouble there. And I'll put it this way. Is critique possible? Is critique really possible? You know, because to raise a critique almost of anything, we could pick some interesting objects right now. A lot of interesting objects right now. Is it all, I can press a little bit further. Is it possible to critique evil? Real evil now. We ain't talking about no cupcake stuff, Pollyannish stuff, you know, I'm talking some real evil. Because, I mean, because so at least to be able to confront evil, you know, it's going to require some sacrifice. And it seems to me that, and I don't want to get too far ahead of sort of, you know, the thought there, but I do wonder, like, how we think about critique right now. That's, you know, because to be able to push back against anything, to resist, it is a critique. We talk so much about intervention. Intervening into what? For what reason? What particular commitments do you have while you're intervening? It gets to the question around normativity. Yikes! Or in service. So, but do we already know what evil is when we see it? Is it one of those kind of things? I can tell you that not everybody agree on it. So, and then you have now like the media landscape. I mean, it's not even a landscape. I mean, that's even a wrong metaphor now. I don't even know, like, I mean, what language we kind of vocabulary use to describe, like, I mean, in the 1950s, somebody coming out Cold War, like, you know, whatever media giant we want to imagine, like that exists right now, they couldn't in the 1950s sort of reach us walking down the street while we're taking a dump, but we're looking at our phones and we're like, we're still being nudged. Because so much of what the social media has become is really just social engineering, as I like to describe it. Who is outside of that? Who gets to stand outside of that? And so so now we see, coming back to the earlier question from the first panel around the real control. And we could just mention, identify one form of that control: gatekeepers. And so much of like the energies and the people who choose to sort of try to change things for the better, use that very loosely, want to be the new gatekeepers. The colonized become the colonizers, become the new elite, the new capitalists. The anti-capitalists become the capitalists, because maybe that's what they were all along. Really, that's really crazy. So that's part of why I was a little bit critical of Black Lives Matter, you know, because I think that's, if we can't avoid that trap, it is a hard, listen, it's a very alluring trap. If somebody offer you, you know, some $1 million, like how many of us gonna walk away? I would like to say that I'm okay. I don't need it. But and maybe in a rough moment, I'm like, well, you know, I got a lot of people I care about. But the thing is, if I'm the only one who caring about them, then yeah, I gotta sweat. But here's the thing, but we shouldn't live in a world where we the only one caring about certain things. Because this gets back to your point too, Eden, about sort of like about sort of organizing, how anti-communism is a way of that category is a way of organizing a certain group, a group of people into it, sweep it up into it. But it's also a way to there's also a way of the way it works as a way of neutralizes that group too. That group neutralizes itself. And part of what I want to just say is that how do we think about if we can't think about what to do apart from ways of organizing ourselves beyond just like taking pictures of ourselves? Like we have all these technologies that we didn't have in the 1950s to organize ourselves. And there has certainly been all kinds of examples around the planet. Totally. But the planet is still here. These technologies are still here. They're more powerful. What's happening? And so I'm just so part of my answer to the question is like we gotta figure out what's going on with critique. And it seems to me a part of what it stalls is organizing, and part of what it also forestalls in the sense that makes it hard to discern, to be able to see how power operates. Because if you can't critique something, that's probably a good indication you up against some real power. It says like because the power says what you think is true is not true. Well, here's all the evidence. It's not true. No, it's not true. You're wrong. You're false. You're the enemy. You got to get ran out of here. You lose your on. So, but here's the thing, the irony, and I swear this is the last thing I'll say. I remember in the early 90s, right? Many of you might remember too, sort of the closing of the American mind. A lot of conservatives were really worried about these liberals are going to brainwash our kids in these universities. You're gonna make them all. They're not gonna believe truth exists. They're gonna think truth is all relative. One sort of word that was organizing this idea: postmodernism. Who are the real postmodernists now? The people on the left who don't have nothing on what let's just call them white Christian analysts have done. Like they literally climb, James is like that's just one example because they don't care about truth. Obviously. But somebody got to be willing to stand up against people who don't care about it, who would tear everything down because they don't care about the truth. And I know it's not easy to figure out what it is, but we gotta be willing to go up against people say it's not something that's not true, especially when they are harming others. That's visible. I can see where somebody's bleeding because of somebody claim of truth. And so this is what we can test. There's ways to verify, like, well, I might not want to believe all your truth sort of framework, but if it's making me bleed, if it's exploiting me, if I can't feed my family. So I think we can go to where we're hurting. That's one way we can start begin to like, because a lot of people out here hurt, and they're not all black. I mean, good grief. I mean, there's a lot to say about I not to go all autobiographical and kind of reverse, like, well, hey, I have white friends, I have white poor friends, I have white, but we should figure out a way to think about and take seriously how we are really, 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 really connected to each other. And it's at so many different registers. That's all. I'm just gonna repeat that for probably the rest of this panel. Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something Xavier said. I was in a very gripping meeting last week on the pedagogy of public speaking class. And we're talking with some of the professors that have been there for quite a while. And we noticed in the last decade, we've seen kind of a trend in our students that they really have a trouble with just kind of standing up and speaking their mind and really kind of understanding how to disagree and disagree well. So either they take one or two approaches. Either they're afraid that they're going to be canceled or they're going to offend somebody, so they don't say anything disagreeable, or they say everything disagreeable and think they have freedom to say anything. And we're realizing that we're looking at our textbook and realizing there's no really unit we talk about how to to respect and disagree. And it's, I think, a real technique, and especially in this era of post-Trump, uncivil discourse is kind of seen as the norm. And especially coming out of the conservative kind of side, I think that we need to kind of think about how do we facilitate those kind of conversations? How do we facilitate them in the classroom and kind of prepare students to kind of speak the truth, but also do it in a way that's not divisive or damaging.
I have a follow-up question for that, but there was a hand. I'll come back.
I just threw my hand up because for me, something that's missing from this conversation is in white nationalism and in the marginalization of people of color and queerness is the historical viewpoint on individualism versus collectivism, right? We have not talked about that today, right? Xavier, when you talk about, oh, they're quote unquote white folks that are poor, whatever, and the Black Lives Matter from earlier, you have to acknowledge that we are a settler colonization country, right? We came in through the historical side as white individualism. What we're seeing in Christian nationalism, and specifically on the internet, is white folks, we don't have a collective because we've always been the norm. And we talk about the demonization of everything that's the other, that's the collectiveness of the queer community, of Black, brown, and yellow, Asian people, right? And so for me in this conversation, that's what's missing when we talk about a call to action and acknowledging the history of Christian nationalism is white Christianity is rooted in individualism. Black religion is rooted in collectivism. If something happens to me as a Black person, it happens to every person of color because they see themselves in that person, right? So when we talk about the historical aspects and we talk about what's happening online, when we think about the future, we can't leave void to the individualistic nature of what that is. Because when I talk to my white Christian nationalist friends of UMC, when I talk to my white Christian friends and what we're going through in the UMC church, it's well, Angel, you all have that group, right? We, most of my church members, most of my congregants are feeling like they have nothing, right? They have nothing to hold on to. Well, you don't have anything to hold on to because you're the majority, right? You've always been the majority. It's always been about you. And now we have Whitney, I love some of the things that you talked about earlier. We have this Trump next, we gotta get back to the time, because at one point from American history, whiteness was the thing, whiteness and Christianity. And now the individual, I'm an immigrant, my immigrants came over, we came over. Yes, slavery was bad, but the Christian nature, we broke free from the Europeans, right? So my family is this, my family is that. So if something happens to me as a white person, the other white person don't see themselves in them because, oh, that's happening to them. And so I just wanted to bring that into the conversation because for me, that is a huge thing that is missing when we talk about going forward and what's happening on the internet now.
Yeah, I think you're so completely right. And I want to just foreground that part of what happens with the long historical demonization, to use Whitney's language, of communist is a demonization of any kind of politics that's collective. So anybody who's engaging in a collective politic, like a queer community or a racialized community, is then a communist, right? And this is just this incredibly persistent way of dismissing that because the individual is the be all end all, right? If this subsumes the individual, then we're in deep trouble because the individual and their agency and sanctity are the thing that we protect here in the United States. And it's just getting me thinking a bit about kind of some of the theological resonances of that, right? And that for many white Christian communities, your state of sinlessness or state of salvation is just the goal. That's the goal, right? You've come to a place where you're now sort of in line, in deep touch with your God, and then you can do no harm thereafter, right? And the sense that you're part of a collective that's doing harm is completely erased once you feel satisfied with your own state of salvation. And I teach evangelicalism in America here at this university. And this is just one of the most persistent conversations I have to have with my students, where it's the idea that everyone getting saved and then everything is fine. That is one of the most individualizing and deeply insidious ideas. And it's just for these, North Carolina students who want to think about evangelicalism and then get really surprised by what I do, it's unshakable. This all that matters is my state of salvation or your state of salvation. So yeah, anyway, thank you for bringing it in. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, both of the comments sort of dovetail into what I was thinking in response to Heidi's point, where how do we think about all of this in our classrooms? Because our classrooms, we can't talk about scaling on social media alone, right? That's not, I can't scale anything on social media, and most of us in this room probably can't either. But we do have a classroom with 24 to 150 students. So how is everybody thinking about some of these issues in the classroom? How do you manage some of the also anxieties around teaching some of this? And then maybe how could we integrate a pedagogical approach that foregrounds collectivism, or at least pushes back against individualism? And that's sort of dovetailing of 3 comments all at once, but the primary question is just, what do we do in our classrooms? Like, how do we think through this in our classrooms?
I'll take a stab because it actually, I literally just did it a couple of days ago. It's not gonna get fully to your question, but I taught Abercrombie Black Christian nationalism. Very few people know this, it seems, even people who are and scholars in these areas. And so Abercrombie was making this critique of individualism, American individualism, how white Christianity is a religion of individualism. I mean, that's one way to sort of kind of was not. So that's what I'm saying. So if you study actually Black religion in various forms, particularly some of its Protestant forms, the collectivity that I've been trying to highlight the entire time, because David Walker's making an appeal to who? Not just to a single person, to a group of people. And he was also making so to get them organized, to get them ready to call to arms. Y'all thought that David Walker just brought it back. And so I had my students reading Cleve there in 68, 69, or Black Messiah, then sort of Black Christian nationalism, I think 71. The Shrine of the Black Madonna, maybe you've heard of it. That's that guy. Black woman, mother, because Jesus' mother is also not white. Yikes. And so if Jesus, that Mary is not white, and she's African, even genetically, by the way, everybody's African, but the Human Genome Project told us that, 20 years ago. Thank you, Bill Clinton. Stop. I'm getting myself in way too much trouble. Jeez. And so, but I mentioned this, and I had my students read a part of Lee because to help them to see sort of like, in so many ways that so much of America's sort of identity is part of, it comes out of sort of an individual, a framework so that it prioritizes the interests of the individual.
I'd like to also add to this too, the theologian Kane Hope Builder, and his work I think is really critical because he describes this, right, and the actual role of settler colonialism in rewriting the iterations of the Bible that we have come to know today, and how collective Blackness was slowly erased via interpretations and written interpretations of the Bible via a colonial mindset. And so I think that also is an important part of our syllabus too, is thinking about, yes, I mean, that, absolutely.
Yeah, I was thinking even as we were just speaking very briefly about the concept of demonology and going back to these questions. One of the things I'm always like looking on Google Scholar for is for a paper about Lil Nas X. Right. And so there's a video, right, if you're not familiar, where he's like literally sliding down a stripper pole and like twerks on the devil, like quite literally. And it's like, flames and stuff, right? And so what happens on TikTok the day afterwards? Well, there are people who are making memes and they're like dancing in hell and they're like, so happy that like I listened to my new favorite song. And like there are people who are walking into heaven like, I'm sorry, Lord, like I just love the way that he twerked on Lil Nas X. And there's this like play that people have in engaging with pop culture. And Lil Nas X afterwards says like, I was ostracized, like you mentioned, Erica, like I was ostracized from the Black church because of my queerness. And like, I came out of that tradition and like, I'm creating music, I'm doing this art for this purpose. And so one of the things that you kind of see in that culture of responding to someone literally twerking on the devil is this question of where does learning happen? And I think that's a part of the question that I hear that I can respond to with your question about the classroom and even your question about individualism versus collectivism, right? Because the Black church has always been our places of learning, right? And we're even seeing that reaction to Governor DeSantis in Florida, right? These Black churches who said, well, we'll teach African-American history if you don't want to learn it in public schools. So where are the spaces of learning? And in some cases, right, people are intentionally going online to access information because they can't get it, you know, wherever they normally would get information, or because they are getting more accurate information, or they believe whatever they've gotten has been misleading, misinformed. And so maybe we can even get at that question of like, where do we see information seeking happening? And even amongst your work, you know, thoughts about where we might think about where can we call a site of learning, where can we call sites of unlearning even, right? Like one of the things I was talking to Xavier about is like people do these, they're essentially apologetics, these TikToks where they say like, you know, you need to deprogram the way that you think about this, right? We need to deconstruct the way that you understand Jesus or the way you understand America as a nation. And these are people who are doing serious unlearning practices online, very serious unlearning practices online. And so then the question becomes, can you learn online? Can critique online? Where do these spaces happen in between? So I'm just wondering if we can think about like sites of learning as we build out where other people can get information and what texts we might want to think about.
Yeah, I would say so our museum has a little over 1 million visitors each year. Each exhibit label is meant to interpret artifacts for an audience that's about 14 years old, give or take. So the average 8th or 9th grader should be able to understand what is happening. That level of accessibility provides this site for learning. And even with in our current climate, is particularly essential given what's happening in K through 12, that you have these kinds of sites that are open to everyone. So I would say that, and then I would say that the whole idea of going to museums in general has become far too traditional and has come under a tremendous amount of criticism as well. And digital curation, this has become a site for the organic curator to say, no, these are the stories that need to be told, or this is how the story should be told outside of museum settings and outside of traditional sites of learning. And so I think those are really important, the things that we create and the things that we create outside of our established institutions.
This is more towards the like Christian nationalism panel. So obviously a lot of it is about like the rhetoric and the discourse and the language used in expressing these ideas of this identity. And Dr. Perry mentioned the term dog whistle, right? And so it would make you think of plausible deniability, which comes up a lot. I study this, and then you get that pushback of like, well, like I'm just a Christian or things like that. And so I'm curious if folks who study this, like, how do you address this plausible deniability, and does the religious Christian aspect complicate it in any way when you're like kind of defending your work in different audiences?
Yeah, so I think the greatest dog whistle is the word Christian, actually. So like I mean that historically, because it means people like me, it means my people, it means like our group and all that implies. And so like the greatest dog whistle the right ever came up with was Christian, because it's better than like bad hombres or thugs or terrorists or inner city, because it's a reverse dog whistle, right? It means us, right? So you can speak that into an audience. And everybody knows what you mean. Everybody knows that you mean our kind of people, our kind of American, our white people, at the very least ethnically and politically white. So part of going into these audiences and speaking to these groups is helping them understand that all religion is fundamentally racialized, because all of our experiences are fundamentally racialized in this context, in this country. So our religious language. And so we do a lot of work to try to unpack this, and we do this empirically. So we show that how white Americans and say African American, Black Americans respond to our various questions about Christian nationalism. I have endless charts and figures about all of these things, and I could show you that as white Americans affirm are indicators of Christian nationalism. Say they answer a question about, like, I believe the United States should declare itself a Christian nation, that Christians have a responsibility to take control of government or something like that. The more white Americans agree with that statement, they immediately respond to it like kind of nostalgia, like, and ideas of white threat, that they are the ones who are discriminated against. They're the ones that are attacked. African Americans can respond to the exact same questions and not see that at all, right? Because for them, the language of Christian values, Christian heritage, Christian nation is, if I may be so bold, at least it comes from our surveys, that is more aspirational, right? Like Martin Luther King Jr. and Frederick Douglass said things about Christian nation, but they weren't thinking about an earlier time when the right people held sway and the right values were in charge. They're thinking about like accountability, the nation, that the values that we were supposed to live up to but never have. So it's trying to help these audiences see that this language is loaded with white racial implicit supremacy, and to try to help them disentangle that and to understand, like, this language that is used by politicians, this language that is used in these circles, is used with that effect, and that's how you're being worked right now. That's how you're being appealed to by say politicians or audiences. And it's also try to help them understand that what you understand as Christian is broader than this kind of very Anglo-Protestant centric conception of what it means to be religious. I love what you said in the earlier panel about like religion being religious expression for everybody else besides white Christians is more than just belief and faith. It's about identity, it's about practices, it's about symbols, it's about all of these things, and so little about faith and belief and theological constructs. And so, yeah, trying to help these communities see, broaden their understanding of who they are and what they really mean by the terms that they use, and how Christian nationalist rhetoric is used to maneuver and appeal and mobilize these audiences towards reactionary goals.
Can I ask a follow-up to this? Because I think this is so important. One of the ways that it's been such an effective political strategy I've seen in just, let's use PragerU as a beautiful example. Much of the face of what you're saying is not white.
Right.
And often, and sometimes not even Christian, right? I mean, Ben Shapiro is a perfect example. Candace Owens is a perfect example, right? And so, I think, I mean, I have some theories on this, right? I would love to hear your
I want to hear what you have to say about it.
No, I asked the question.
Well, that's what I was thinking about with Angel's question as well. Like, what do you do for a group that has historically had to think collectively, buying into individual salvation or religion? I was at a church service some time ago, and the pastor of my large non-denominational, predominantly Black church, says Jesus is not your personal Lord and Savior. And, you know, it was clutching of the pearls. I mean, the people were very harmed theologically by that in a Black church setting. Like, you would think you're talking about a white evangelical space, but these are concepts that Black folks take on and get something out of them. And I would say, in that regard, from another, the pendulum swings both ways. From on the same spectrum, it is aspirational in the same way, that the hope is that whiteness will save us. To align with America is to be saved. That I think is a problem when Black folks are caping for whiteness. That has to be in the mix, you know. It's not as dangerous, but it's one of those things that I would be really interested to hear when you have audiences. What is the response from Black folks when they hear how white folks respond to religion. Like, oh, is that me too? You know, like if they see themselves as well, because I don't know, that feels like almost the whole of the Black church. Yeah. Yes, I don't know if that answers your question, but it raises a lot of other ones for me.
You know, I would say, you know, I don't know all of what I really want to say about this, but I'll mention it because I think it's important for it to be sort of a part of the conversation somehow. You know, there's a number of Black evangelicals. Arguably, you know, sort of so much of like Black Protestantism is evangelical. Theologically, emphasis on the theological, politically, maybe less so. That's an important distinction that actually is so much of like the scholarship in American religious history and they don't even account for it. You know, me and Larissa was talking also at the break, you know, where at the sort of religious broadcast conference, right? Apparently Tony Evans' name was mentioned. If anybody know that name, sure some of y'all know Sam shaking that. So, you know, Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship. Tony was the first Black person to get a PhD at Dallas Theological Seminary. Expositional preaching, expository, verse by verse, word by word. Watch this. Also influenced by these white expositors, white biblical expositors, like John MacArthur. Right, and so now, but there's also another person out there who people need to know, Tom Skinner. Tom Skinner was this was in the 60s. Tom Skinner was Black evangelical, self-identified. Campus Crusade, when Campus Crusade first started to get up Urbana, you know, I feel like I don't turn into an American religious historian on the panel. I did not come to do that. And so on that on record. So all my religious stories are there, like they crucify me, but there's so much to say about all these things. But I mention that because Tom Skinner wrote an important book. You know, he's trying to grapple with these things, this Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, and particularly inside of sort of this white evangelical strongholds, I mean Presbyterian, number of different denominations, the Methodists, etc. But he wrote How Black is the Gospel? Black evangelical. And so part of what I was just trying to introduce is that, like, I think even to get inside of like how Black Christians are thinking about themselves, their identity as Christian, to understand what that the specifics of that is very complicated without a sophisticated theological sort of apparatus. You know, because it's shifting so much with the spirituality, we're talking about all this, it makes it even more when it's being more and more so these theological vocabularies, these religious terms are being more and more disassociated from certain sets of doctrine, certain sets of traditions, religion, you know, but yet they're still invoking these languages, they're still engaging some similar sort of practices. And so I mean, there's a way in which sort of like very, very, I mean, we know this is kind of like standard hat for certain kinds of like Black religious scholars, is that very small percentage of Black churches are actually radical, as we think of like liberatory. Like King was all out there by himself for the most part. You know, and we can look around, you know, Black Lives Matter, they were out there by themselves too, in some ways, many ways. So anyway, so in that sense, you know, to try to think about like what is the term Christian you were mentioning, you know, Sam, like, you know, once you start thinking about that in particular sorts of Black context, it gets even more sort of, it's working against itself in a lot of ways that we haven't sort of, as always, been able to analytically sort out in some of the scholarship and thinking.
I guess this is going back a bit, but I think as educators, we have a tendency to overrate a learning model of change, where I think the problem is, it's not like, forgive my injury here, but like, it's not the case of like, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. I think white people are perfectly happy and indeed enjoy the violence that they perpetrate in the cases not so much learning, teaching them so much as preventing. And I think we have an organizational model of that in the sense of like, how do you make somebody stop doing what you don't want them to do? How to, like, rather than in terms of like in the classroom and in our teaching, but rather think of ourselves as workers in the university. For example, I know this school has a storied history of being racist as all hell, like me, Joe, just notably recently. How can we move in the workplace as that, rather, although there is a place for it in the classroom, obviously, as well, in teaching these media histories of labor, media histories of like, who built this thing? Why was it built this way? You can look to like the Panthers newspaper, for example, it's like media production challenge. And I think like, for me, that's at least a lot more effective in my teaching as well, would be like, look at what Frederick Douglass was theorizing in photography, for example, and how Bill was for it, rather than like presuming and like I've taught a child, now they're going to be better like it. There's like a very limited sphere of my life of their life in which I'm to be. And so I think like in our organizations, we can use our labor power to enact that change.
Well, I mean, that's interesting because, you know, one of the concerns that a lot of people, maybe anybody on the panel could speak to this, but a lot of the professors who I talk to about these kinds of issues are very worried about, you know, what they present in the classroom and what the consequences for them might be. And so there's a discussion of how do you teach these things, and pedagogically, how might you intervene, or how could you tell the stories in a better way? And that's all really good and important, but then sometimes what gets left out of that discussion is how do our deans protect us? How does the institution itself protect us? How can the institution sort of turn itself towards, I don't necessarily want to say an interventionist model, but is it on the professors themselves to do this work, and how are they being protected or not? And then you have to talk about different states and different institutions being more or less protective, and that's going to influence the kinds of things that get taught. So, you know, what teachers do is important, but what administrators do is at the very least equally important. And if you don't have it up here, what are we going to do down here? And I think that's a really vexing problem, you know, and certain institutions are safer than other institutions. But what do you do if you're at, you know, a public school in Florida?
I mean, I think Xavier said it really, really at the beginning, right? Is pretty possible in its real, true form. I mean, I think the fact that we have this happening is a big deal-ish. But I know we also feel constraints by what we say. And so is that organizing? I don't know. I love that. I mean, it's a great question, but whenever all these questions, I think you really hit it. Is that possible? Yeah.
Go and see there was a wildcat for sunset. You know, like there was a wildcat strike at this university because like my question, like I would take up your question with you and say like, how do we make the institution better? You know, rather than like, because the institution's not. You know, especially UNC as an institution, we've seen time and time over, they're invested in hurting us. And so what sort of power do we have, either inside or outside of these channels, and then look to the historical examples of, for example, the wildcat strike on this campus 5 years ago to remove silence. Sorry.
Well, I have a comment that complicates the question, suggestion. So one of the things that I found really interesting in recent years is I studied Catholic education often, and since the late 1970s, there's a Supreme Court case in the United States that NCLRB versus Catholic Bishop of Chicago. Basically, the National Labor Relations Board cannot intervene in the organizing of teachers in religious schools at the K-12 in the United States because of this case in the 70s. And so like that makes me wonder, like, what are the other legal structures that impede the ability of educators to mobilize, and how does religion fit into that, especially with all the kind of First Amendment cases that are circulating around education in the United States today. There are increasing numbers of obstacles, I think, to being able to mobilize in ways, even though I agree that that is a really substantive way that in higher ed particularly.
I really like, appreciate the comment there, about sort of the making protections. I mean, I think especially in my context, I'm still learning about it because it's actually, news that since I've been here, that at Cornell University, I guess the graduate students and sort of contingent sort of like, workers of various sorts, have formed a union. You know, so the details are gotta get worked out, but that's happening at Cornell University. At Duke too. Well, you know, Duke broke it open here in North Carolina. Or was it Elon? I think Elon was first, then Duke. And so, yeah, I mean, what I want to also say about sort of think about protections, in educational context. And I don't want to be careful to not be too flippant about this in terms of my own particular experiences, is that I don't want to say never, but I just really never thought about sort of protection and education together in a way. And I don't say that to be sort of unmindful about a lot of things, but I said it because education has never been professional enterprise. What's happened here at Chapel Hill? Not for me. Because for me, education is about formation. It's not just about giving you information. You know, when I was as a Sunday school teacher, you read in the bio was read like, youth developing youth my entire life. As a youth, I was developing youth, developing other adults and so forth. So when I think about education, I'm thinking about this thing not just in a professionalized setting. And so I think the problem of education has been precisely that. It is overly professionalized. It's about credentials. And so I tell students like, listen, listen. If you come here to learn, I got something for you. If you just come here just so you can get a couple of checks off your boss, you had to get the right set of like credentialing so you get to where you're going. You're not really interested in learning anything because you're learning. I mean, you're interested in sort of, that requires deep engagement. And coming back to sort of the critique, thank you for bringing it back to this point. I mean, that's what it means to be Socratic. And this is what it's about, the shaping of cells. The Catholic sort of question that came with the question. So thank you bringing that in too, because it's about formation. Catholics know a lot about formation. They know a lot of stuff about malformation, especially in education. And so part of what I want to say to, the question about sort of like people got to be protected. Let me be very clear about that. In all kinds of settings, but especially in educational settings. I mean, I'm at Cornell University, crying out loud, so contextualize all of what I'm saying as much as you can. And stuff that's been happening there in terms of protections that are being asked for right now. Faculty members under attack. A truck running around Cornell University, big billboard with, professor space, all this kind of stuff on there. Dear brother Russell Riffer, y'all heard about him. If you haven't, you better go look it up. So, because who is like, So I'm coming at this thing, from a lot of different ways, like we all are, but especially sort of hot because the campus of Cornell has been like really, really hot. And the question is, one of the major questions that's kind of circulating and people are worried about all the way top, all the way down, for those who might hear, is like, who's gonna be protected around here? Y'all heard about sort of the threat that was made and the guy was arrested. So this is all, and if you ever been to Ithaca, it's like kind of isolated. So you would think ain't nothing going down like that. And so, but it's a lot, yeah. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, to the point about who's going to be protected, I often think, especially with institutions, you have this time of perhaps radical change, or at least conversations around radical change. And then the institution clamps down on that. And you're like, I thought we were. And it is us faculty or students or movement folks. And then that kind of dissipates. In my time in academia, I just remember being severely tired. Just the work that it takes around the work, that kind of labor. As we would say in my Black church, it is the attempt of the enemy to wear out the saints. And the saints be worn out in academic spaces. The ones who are doing the real sacred work, movement work, are often the most tired. I'm reminded, I was trying to think of who it was. It was Fred Moulton who said, steal what you can, from the university, pilfering resources, for the movement, I think it requires a wiliness, a kind of nimbleness in these times, in order to maintain and in order to do some kind of radical work with the knowledge that the institution is the spiritual wickedness in high places. It is the principality that must be pulled down. That I think that's not all you can do, but that is all you can actually do in light of that.
No, I just want to add, I think I have not given up on pedagogy and like teaching and being able to, and actually I would say as a majority group member in every respect that I can imagine, like I think I wield a lot of authority in that classroom. Like that is given, that is granted, it's unfair, but I do, and I know that if I speak up adamantly on behalf of people who don't have that same kind of authority and position, I think my students listen. I really do. Like they say they do. I think they respond well. They don't come after me. They say, wow, you're a white guy. You're a white Christian guy. You have no reason to say that other than here's the data and that's what you believe. And that must mean something. And it's unfair that voice matters than the voices of others. But I think it matters. And so while not discounting the idea of labor, like at organizing, totally on board with that idea. At the same time, like I want to use the influence that I do have, and I think hopefully other majority group faculty on campus anywhere would say, I don't want to put this, not to take the lead in the conversation, I don't mean that, but I mean would use their voice and authority to be able to speak up on behalf of those who can't.
Get discredited.
Yeah, right, exactly, right.
Yeah.
We're close to the end, but I do want to ask one more final
Yay,
kind of
you asked
closing
us.
question. Yeah.
You deserve it after all.
Okay. So I'm thinking about some of the things that I wrote down between both of the panels and what we're talking about now. So the H word, hope, came up in our first panel. And we talked a little bit about, I think you mentioned it, Erica, Edward Said, and you just mentioned right now the idea of like the other, and one of the things that you contextualize yourself, Francesca, was that like we're talking largely about Christianity in this conversation, right? But there's a lot of other religious traditions that we can talk about, and that's a part of contesting the idea of what is American religion, right? So in thinking about how we might move forward with the study of what's happening on the internet, with the study of religion and the internet, what other scholars should we be engaged with, and who are the people, even if it's popular press, right? Who else needs to be heard in this conversation? I mean, I'm hearing not only like people who are specialists in Cold War, I'm hearing texts on fascism, I'm hearing Black religious traditions, I'm hearing even maybe Black mysticists, right? Maybe Howard Thurman needs to be in there. So I'm really curious about what you all might think, reflecting on what we've talked about today, especially thinking about, I don't know if you feel this way as well, Heidi, that digital religion is such an interdisciplinary study. It's across communication fields, across religious studies. So where else should we be looking? What other text should we be thinking about as we kind of think about the future of where this conversation can go after the panel today?
I would say.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I just want to get the title right.
Okay. That was actually Omar Ibn Said.
Okay.
And his narrative. And I think the narrative is taking another look at the conversation around technology and patterns around networks as they appear in the slave narratives are really important sites. Saeed's is phenomenal to me because he makes the intentional choice to write in Arabic. And it is in itself a critique of Christianity, in that for him, language is synonymous with Christianity. And so to write the document in Arabic is to critique this Christian nation, and to also say something about his experience, and to lift up surahs that talk about the dominance of God over and against the dominance of white slave masters. So I think there's still so much mining, religious and technological mining, to be made out of those narratives that connects to ongoing narratives that we see on TikTok and from influencer and creative folks today, that mirrors those kind of patterns of earlier.
Just a quick book, Rob Eshman, who's a professor at Columbia in social work. And so his new book, this is actually really, really recent, When the Hood Comes Off, Racism and Resistance in the Digital Age. It's not a book about religion, but it is about anti-racist tactics to respond to racism on the internet. So he's talks about both the racism that appears within this kind of anonymous kind of context, but also anti-racist tactics to confront in that space. That's maybe 2023. Okay.
I don't have a title. I just think there's so much more to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I really like, I teach a course on religion and technology, and I feel I struggle to find stuff to assign every year. And students love it, and it's such a great like intersection to think with. So I guess that it's more of a like go forth than a like what we already have. I just think there's so many unturned stones in this space that yeah, there's a lot of promise, but also like a lot of gaps. I mean, I've enjoyed Erica's book quite a bit on digital religion.
I would say, like, for people who want to get some basic kind of knowledge about kind of what research has been done on kind of the internet and racism, any of the work of Lisa Nakamura, that would be the starting point, I would say. And then I think in digital religion, the work of Pauline Hope Chong at Arizona State, she works as an intercultural studies, and she does some interesting work looking at issues of kind of, religion, race, identity in both Buddhist and Christian contexts. So that's where I start.
How about you all? Anything else? Well, we can share it too after this.
Yes, yeah. So
I guess it is after 4.
it is. Yes, yes.
Well, thank you again, everybody.